Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. Today's video is about policy making in the United States with regards to the environment and natural resources. Over the course of this video, you should learn how to explain why environmental policymaking is so shrouded in controversy. Politics plays a big part in environmental policy. You should also be able to identify the primary areas where environmental policy has an effect and attempts to affect change. And you should also be able to list and describe some of the most important pieces of legislation that have been passed over the past half century that were designed with the goal of protecting the environment. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. Even if you're just a casual observer of the news and current events, I'm sure you're aware that frequently the Republicans and Democrats fight over environmental policy. The two sides, liberal and conservative, often have very different viewpoints with regards to what problems exist and to what extent they exist and what the most effective solutions are. Should there be very heavy regulation of industries that pollute, or is that a mechanism that's going to harm job creation, for instance. So interest groups play into this a lot too. The Sierra Club and other environmental organizations tend to support Democratic candidates and politicians, whereas chambers of commerce and big business, which are often our heaviest polluters, are going to support the Republican side. So that's where you see these arguments about, the human impact on global warming, for instance, come about. But climate change and global warming are only a couple of the areas that are big bones of contention and concern with regards to environmental policy making. There's also the debate over the role of the government in protecting species that have become endangered due to habitat elimination, hunting, etc. There's also the effect of automobile pollution, which has become very significant problem in urban areas over the last 50 years or so, and also the use of pesticides and its impact on our ecosystem. So we're going to talk just a little bit about each of these. But first, just a little bit on the origins of the environmental movement and environmental policy making in the United States. In the early 20th century, conservation became a big focus of the U.S. government, due in large part to the influence of President Teddy Roosevelt, who was a big outdoorsman and was a big fan of preserving wildlife, natural habitats, and the majestic, uniquely American beauty of the American West, especially. The modern environmental movement, where humans took a vested interest in protecting the environment, really began in earnest in the 1960s with a series of articles and books that came out about humans' adverse impact on the earth. And that led to the passage of quite a bit of legislation during the Richard Nixon administration in the early 1970s, some of which we've already talked about if you're one of my students. The Clean Air Act, passed in 1970, which regulated pollutants. The creation of the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate and enforce the Clean Air Act happened the same year. The first Earth Day was held in 1970 to try to raise awareness of environmental issues. And then the Endangered Species Act passed in 1973. So now let's take a look one by one at each of those areas that we discussed a moment ago. First is climate change. The fact is that the planet is getting warmer, and that's very hard to dispute. Average temperatures are up. Glaciers are melting. The sea level is rising, although very, very, very slowly. The controversy here comes from what are the causes of climate change and global warming. Is it man-made or not? And this has become a very highly politicized issue, with some politicians going so far as to call global warming a hoax, perpetuated by scientists and the liberal establishment in the media. A prime example of media that has sort of brought climate change to the public forefront would be the documentary An Inconvenient Truth, which was bankrolled by former Vice President Al Gore, in which he laid out some of the evidence for global warming and suggestions of what people could do to make it better. So with more and more politicians injecting themselves into the debate on climate change, it does become much more politicized and much more polarizing. But it's pretty hard to deny that climate change is actually occurring. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 mandated that animals that were in dire danger of being driven to extinction could not be killed, bought, sold, or have their habitats interfered with. This has had some success stories over the last 40 years, most notably possibly the bald eagle, which had become very close to extinction because of elimination of habitat primarily as of the 1970s, but today has rebounded to the point where it's actually been removed from the endangered species list. It is still considered a protected species in the United States. You can't just go out and kill a bald eagle. Not sure why you would even want to. The controversy over the Endangered Species Act arises from just how effective it is compared to how much it costs to maintain the list and then regulate the protection of those animals. Approximately 1% of the animals who've been on the endangered species list over the years have been removed from the endangered species list. So some people claim that it's really not worth it or it costs too much. There's also an effect on businesses where businesses are not allowed to do things on their land that they own because it may be interfering with the habitat of an endangered species. And so what you'll see in some cases, especially out west, is farmers or business owners who own large tracts of land will destroy the trees on that land to keep them from becoming a habitat or potential habitat for an endangered bird. They see the Endangered Species Act as sort of hampering potential growth of business, but I think we can mostly agree that it would be nice to have some of those endangered animals, stick around on the earth for a while. Automobile pollution became a major concern in the late 20th century as many of America's largest cities, most notably Los Angeles, became incredibly dirty with regards to smog and just air pollution and unsafe breathing air in some cases, I guess. So the Clean Air Act of 1970 imposed really, really tough standards on how much harmful material a car could produce. And it's been relaxed a little bit in recent years, especially in more rural states. It's regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. Most states follow the emission standards that are set by the California state government because they're really, really stringent. And if cars will be built by the automakers in accordance with California emission standards, because if it can pass in California, it can pass in every state. And in North Carolina, if you're one of my students, when you get your car inspected, it does go through an emissions test to make sure it's not putting too much harmful stuff out into the air. Finally, a look at the regulation of pesticides. Pesticides have been used by farmers for a long time to keep insects and other parasites off of the plants that are being grown. But most notably, there was one called DDT that was very harmful to birds and other wildlife, not just insects, and it could also run off into the water supply and possibly cause some problems there. Rachel Carson is an environmentalist, she's pictured there, who wrote a book in 1963 called Silent Spring, which mainly focused on the harmful effects of DDT. And that book is often given credit with giving rise to the modern environmental movement that culminated in all that legislation from the 70s that we talked about earlier. So DDT was eventually banned at the height of the environmental movement in the early 1970s, which was her primary goal in writing the book. The EPA has the authority to inspect all pesticides that are on the market and determine whether or not they're safe. That's not very effective, though, just because there's so many pesticides on the market that it's virtually impossible for the EPA to thoroughly and accurately assess the reliability of and safety of all of them. So finally, a quick look at some of the results of the environmental movement and the environmental policy that the government has put out there in the last 40 years or so. It's hard to deny that there are some successes. The air and water are definitely cleaner than they were at the beginning of the environmental movement. You don't have a lot of cases anymore of rivers catching on fire, like what happened to the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland on a couple of occasions in the late 1960s, where they were so polluted that they literally caught on fire. Look it up, YouTube it. There's been a lot of more conservation of habitats and endangered species, and there's more protection afforded to them. And most importantly, possibly, there's a lot more public awareness of our impact on the earth. And so Americans and people across the world nowadays are much more cognizant of what they're doing and its impact on the environment. There are still some problems out there. We talked about some of the inefficiencies of the policies that are out there regarding pesticides and things like that. But hazardous waste disposal and what to do with toxic waste from factories and power plants, that's probably the biggest problem. There's still a lot of controversy regarding what should actually be done with that stuff. Most notably, the environmental movement has given rise to what we would call the green movement, which focuses on more renewable, efficient, environmentally friendly sources of energy. And this change is very slow in coming, but the most notable example of it is the rise of the new style of light bulb, which uses much less energy and lasts longer. It is, still resisted by some because they are more expensive, but they tend to put off more light and, again, cost you a lot less on your electric bill. That'll do it for today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and make sure you review this for the test leading up to the AP exam. Cheers.